On a lonely stretch of Colorado's Highway 70, the snow fell like a curtain of white, blotting out the world beyond the glass windows of a diner that once buzzed with life, but now stood nearly empty. Behind the counter, a weary woman named Sarah Williams counted and recounted the pitiful stack of bills in her trembling hands. $47, nothing more. 7 days, that's all she had before the bank came to strip her of the diner she and her late husband Robert had built with hope and sweat 15 years ago. Robert was gone now, cancer having stolen his laughter and warmth 2 winters past, and Sarah had been left fighting a losing battle against debt, storms, and loneliness. The diner's booths were cracked. The neon sign outside flickered like a dying ember, and the foreclosure notice mocked her from beneath the register. The blizzard roared outside, burying the pumps, rattling the windows, shaking the very bones of the building until it seemed even the walls were ready to give up. She moved slowly across the floor, touching booth 4, Robert's booth, his favorite place, where she could still see his smile if she closed her eyes long enough. Now, at 50 years old, Sarah stood on the edge of ruin, her dreams crumbling with each passing hour. It was in that darkness, when she reached for the light switch to close the diner forever, that a new sound rose through the storm. Not the steady scrape of a snowplow, not the howl of the wind. This was deeper, rhythmic, like the beating of 1,000 drums. She pressed her face to the frost-glazed window and saw headlights piercing through the snow, 15 of them, side by side, steel monsters cutting their way into her parking lot. And in that moment, Sarah's empty diner was about to become the setting for a night that would change her life, and the lives of countless others forever. The storm pushed against the walls as 15 men on roaring Harleys dismounted in unison, their boots crunching in the snow, their leather jackets stiff with frost. At the front of them walked a giant of a man with salt and pepper hair pulled into a ponytail, a scar running down his face, and pale blue eyes sharp as shards of ice. His patch told Sarah everything she needed to know. Hell's Angels, one of the most feared motorcycle clubs in America. They were the kind of men you read about in headlines, men with reputations heavy enough to silence entire towns. Sarah froze at the counter, debating whether to flip the sign to closed and lock the door. But then she saw him limp, saw the weariness in his stride, saw how the others slumped like they had been fighting the storm for hours. He knocked 3 soft raps, more respectful than she could have imagined, and for a moment she hesitated. Behind him, the others removed their helmets, tattoos winding down their necks, faces carved by years of road and hardship. These were men the world told you to fear, but Sarah saw something more: exhaustion, hunger, and a desperate hope for shelter. Robert's voice echoed in her memory that promise he'd made so long ago: "Will be a light for travelers, a home away from home." And so, with her heart pounding and fear clawing at her chest, Sarah unlocked the door and opened it to the storm. What stepped inside wasn't 15 outlaws. It was 15 men on the edge of collapse, who carried their legends on their backs and their humanity in the frost-bitten lines of their faces. As the door swung shut against the blizzard, the diner filled with the weight of their presence. The leather creaked as they shrugged off snow, boots stomped against the linoleum, and steam rose from their jackets as the warmth inside began to thaw them. Sarah counted quickly, 15 of them, just as the leader had said. Some were young, full of restless energy, while others carried themselves like veterans of too many battles, their scars telling stories even their voices didn't need to. The leader introduced himself as Jake Morrison, president of the Thunder Ridge chapter, and though his voice was rough from the cold and years of cigarettes, there was a politeness to his tone that disarmed her. "We've been riding 12 hours in this storm," he explained. "The highway shut down 10 miles back. We won't make it without a place to wait it out." Sarah hesitated, staring at the foreclosure notice hidden under the register, then at the $47 crumpled in her pocket. These weren't men she could afford to feed, but how could she turn them away when they stood there shivering, their eyes pleading for the simplest of comforts, a hot meal and a safe roof over their heads? She nodded, motioning them toward the booths, and set about making what little food she had left. The men filled the diner carefully, moving with surprising gentleness, almost as if they understood they were intruding on something fragile. The one with the mohawk held the door for the youngest, a kid no older than 22 who looked nervous and out of place. Jake settled at the counter, his jacket hanging open to reveal his patch, the word President embroidered proudly beneath it, and a small American flag pin that somehow seemed almost ironic. As Sarah poured the first steaming mugs of coffee, the storm outside howled louder, rattling the glass, but inside, the diner flickered with something she hadn't felt in years: life. By 10 o'clock, the diner had transformed into a strange refuge. The storm had worsened, shutting down the highway completely, trapping them all together in that tiny outpost. The men had dozed in booths, played cards with worn decks pulled from their jackets, and shared stories among themselves that Sarah caught in fragments: names of lost brothers, long roads traveled, scars that weren't all on the outside. She had scraped together cans of soup and the last of her bread, apologizing for the meager portions, but to her surprise, the bikers treated the food as though it were a feast. They warmed their hands on mugs of coffee, their gratitude evident in their softened expressions. Sarah noticed small things: the older one draping his jacket over the young kid who had fallen asleep at the table, saying quietly that the boy reminded him of his son overseas in Afghanistan. Another offered to help wash dishes, though Sarah waved him off. It was in those quiet moments that her perception shifted. These weren't villains from headlines. They were fathers, sons, brothers, men carrying burdens just like anyone else. Jake eventually approached the counter again, his sharp eyes glancing at the foreclosure notice Sarah had failed to tuck away fully. He didn't ask immediately, but when he did, his question cut through her defenses. "How long do you have?" she admitted. 7 days. 7 days until the bank took everything she and Robert had built. Jake leaned back, his jaw tight, and for the first time since he'd entered, there was a fire in his expression. "You opened your doors to us when you didn't have to. That makes your problem our problem." Sarah tried to protest, but he only shook his head, already pulling out his phone and stepping into the storm to make calls. She watched him through the window, pacing in the snow, his breath rising in plumes of steam as he spoke urgently to people she couldn't see. She didn't know what he was planning, but for the first time in months, she felt something she thought she'd lost forever: hope. The night wore on, and with it came revelations Sarah never expected. As the bikers shared coffee and warmth, stories began to spill across the booths. A burly man named Marcus recognized Sarah, remembering a night 13 years ago when she had saved the life of his brother-in-law, a trucker named Tommy Patterson, who had collapsed in her parking lot with chest pains. She had not only called for help, but driven him through a rockslide herself to reach a hospital. Sarah's breath caught. She remembered that night, remembered the terror in the man's eyes, the way Robert had stayed with her the whole time, making sure Tommy lived to see another day. Marcus grinned, saying Tommy had never stopped telling the story of the angel who saved him. Then came more voices, more memories. A biker recalled when Sarah had helped him fix his bike in the snow with Robert refusing payment. Another remembered a night when she had given him food and coffee after an accident had left him stranded. And then, in a voice trembling with emotion, the youngest, Danny, spoke. He told of arriving here years ago, broken, with nothing left to live for. Sarah had served him a hot meal, refused his last $5, and told him sometimes not knowing where you're going is the first step to finding where you belong. That kindness, he said, had saved him, had led him to a job, to a family, to this brotherhood. His voice cracked as he admitted he might not be alive if not for her. The diner fell into a heavy silence, the kind that hums with meaning. Sarah sat behind the counter, stunned, realizing she had been a beacon all along. She hadn't just run a diner, she had saved lives. And in the eyes of these men, she wasn't just a widow clinging to memories. She was a legend. By midnight, headlights began to pierce the storm again. But these weren't motorcycles. One by one, trucks, sedans, semis pulled into the lot, their drivers stepping into the diner with faces lit by recognition. Tommy Patterson himself was the first through the door, sweeping Sarah into a hug that nearly knocked the air from her lungs, booming that he had waited 13 years for the chance to repay her. Behind him came others, families, truckers, travelers, each with their own story of how Sarah and her diner had been a lifeline in their darkest hours. The diner filled with voices, laughter, gratitude, until it felt as though the walls themselves were glowing from the warmth inside. Sarah stood in awe, realizing that Jake's phone calls had spread across a vast network of people who remembered her kindness and refused to let her lose the place that had once saved them. Soon the parking lot was overflowing with cars, trucks, and motorcycles, until it seemed the whole mountain had come alive. Outside, the storm still raged, but inside, Midnight Haven was filled with light, the kind of light Robert had always dreamed it would be. Dawn broke on a sight that Sarah could never have imagined. The snow-covered parking lot was crammed with motorcycles from every direction, their chrome gleaming in the rising sun. Bikers from Oakland, Denver, Phoenix, Salt Lake City, men who normally wouldn't share a table were now sitting shoulder to shoulder in her diner, united by one thing, her. Stories poured forth like a flood, each one a reminder of the countless lives she had touched without even realizing it. And then came the envelopes. Cash collected from every chapter represented there, tens of thousands of dollars handed over without hesitation. Jake placed the final envelope in her hands, $68,000, enough to save the diner and secure its future. Sarah trembled, insisting it was too much, but the crowd silenced her. "It's not charity," one said firmly. "It's payment for debts long overdue." Then Jake unrolled a set of plans, architects' drawings showing an expanded diner, biker facilities, secure parking. Midnight Haven wasn't just going to survive. It was going to become a landmark, a haven for every rider on Highway 70. The roar of engines outside shook the ground as news of what had happened spread. "Keep the lights on, Angel," Jake told her as he prepared to leave. "Because you're not alone anymore. You've got the most powerful family in America watching over you now." 6 months later, Midnight Haven was no longer just a diner. It was a sanctuary, a living legend on the western highways. Featured in biker magazines, whispered about in trucker radios, its reputation spread far and wide. Yet for Sarah, it wasn't about the fame or the protection of the Hells Angels. It was about the simple truth she had rediscovered that night. Kindness matters, and when you give it freely, it comes back in ways you can never imagine. Every morning, as bikers rolled in from across the country, Sarah greeted them with the same words. The light's on, the coffee's hot, and the road is always open for family. Midnight Haven had become exactly what Robert dreamed it would be, a beacon. And as the engines roared and the neon sign glowed proudly once again, Sarah knew that the story of her diner would live on long after her. Because sometimes, legends aren't built from power or wealth. They're built from love, kindness, and the courage to open your door when the world tells you to lock it. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more powerful tales, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next story that just might change the way you see the world.